Hello YouTubers, it's Travis, welcome back. I have for you today another lunch lesson. It's the last one I have recorded at the moment, but as these happen, I may still continue to upload them here. Do be sure to let me know in the comments if this is content that you enjoy, and in that case, I'll prioritize making it. But today we talked a little bit about sideboarding, which I think is probably due for a full-on joy of drafting video at some point. But until I get around to doing that, perhaps this can tide you over and give you some ideas about sideboarding. I'd had a lot of people say things like they were nervous about trying a best of 3 draft because they were confused about sideboarding, and I don't think it's actually that complicated. So hopefully you will enjoy this, and we'll see you back again soon for more drafting. Enjoy your lunch. All right, so the plan was we're going to have a lunch lesson today, and kind of what I wanted to talk about was sideboarding, in addition to enjoying my soup. It's pretty good soup. There was a person in here yesterday that was saying that sideboarding was one of the things that was keeping them from wanting to play best of 3 because they were nervous about it and they weren't sure exactly how it works, and it's kind of what was keeping them from going to best of 3 from best of 1. And I was like, okay, I can appreciate that. And I like to think sideboarding kind of has a couple different steps. Let's walk through those. And feel free to ask questions as we're going. So there's some cards, like this is level 1 of sideboarding, okay? I'm sure there's a disenchant in here, right? Yeah, there's a disenchant. Like, here's a very obvious sideboard card. And this is kind of like level 1 sideboarding. A sideboard card is an incredibly narrow card that's going to do something very specific to counter something your opponent's doing. And the best example of that is enchantment or artifact removal. There's formats where you main deck enchantment and artifact removal because it's all over the place. So I'm not talking about that, right? I can't exactly think of any off the top of my head, but I can remember there were formats where we're like, yeah, you would main deck a disenchant, and some where you wouldn't. I imagine if there was one in Theros, you would main deck it, for example, because there were enchantments everywhere. Yeah, I did an AFR, and Fair Kaladesh is a really good example, Chris. Yeah, Plummet's the same style of card, but I can remember in Kaladesh, you would first pick enchantment or artifact removal. And I seem to remember people telling me that was the case in Mirrodin as well, although I didn't play Mirrodin. So there's a lot of cards that fit this bill, right? It's a narrow card that's going to answer something specific. Sometimes they have color hosers, like destroy target green creature, right? You probably don't want to put that in your main deck. So this is like level 1 of sideboarding, is if your opponent has the narrow card that you have the sideboard answer for, you bring in the sideboard answer. And again, disenchant, plummet, there's all sorts of this type of effect. Destroy target black creature, tap target red creature, it can't untap. We've seen color hosers too. The trick with these is when there are good sideboard cards, when are you supposed to pick them up? And then it's like, okay, it depends on how good they are and how good the targets are, right? Like there's some format, and this does require some format specific knowledge, but I would say a color hoser. Let me find an example of one of those, because I remember there were some in AFR. Weren't they uncommon? Because we don't get these all the time, but we do get them regularly. Divine Smite. Like, here's an excellent example of one. Target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls phases out. That does virtually nothing. You're not playing it for that. If that permanent is black, exile it instead. If you're playing against a deck that has 9 black creatures, this is the best card in your deck against them. If you're playing against a deck that has 0 black creatures, you don't want this at all. But here's the thing I don't think people realize when they're picking cards for sideboard, because I would routinely see this card come back around when there were white commons missing in AFR. So let this settle in for a minute. In your average draft, you're going to play more games with your sideboarded deck than you will with your main deck. Because it's always going to be 50-50 at least, right? Even if you win the first game and win the second, or lose the first game and lose the second, it's 50-50. But if you ever go to a game 3, you've played more with your sideboard than without it. So that means that powerful sideboard cards are almost like 2/3 better than a regular main deck card. Like, that's pretty freaking incredible. So when you get a sideboard card that's that good, and this is also format dependent, because I'm not suggesting that you pick disenchants like crazy high. But I am saying that something like Divine Smite, and basically this entire cycle of color hosers, Ray of Enfeeblement was another one that was really good. Now, a lot of people would just main deck Ray of Enfeeblement, because at least it did something the other way. That's why I think the white one's a really good example. Burning Hands, too. People would just main deck it. But here's one that just basically does flat nothing, unless it's a black creature. This is better than all of the filler level cards you're taking. So I would routinely see packs go by that had this and some decent commons for white. I don't exactly remember what all of them were, but I'd see this come back and be like, that's just stupid. Everyone who was in white and didn't take it was probably wrong. Because, like, I think that's the most powerful lesson I can give you, is that you're going to play more games with your sideboarded deck than you are with your main deck. So, like, level 1 of sideboarding is look at the cards that you have in your sideboard that are narrow and pick them high enough that you have access to them. And then bring them in when your opponent has something narrow. Here's the next piece. This is all of the cards that are in the format for Innistrad Midnight Hunt. I've memorized most of these cards. If you use the proper card name, I can probably tell you what it does. After the first game, this format gets cut down into 23 cards. I suppose it's technically 46 cards. The 23 you're playing and the 23 they're playing. And you'll know about half of them after you've played one game, unless you got run over or they got run over. And sometimes that happens. If you've watched me play a lot, you've probably seen me very quickly win or lose game 1 and say, I don't have enough information to sideboard, and immediately click. And it's because I don't really know anything that they're doing other than that they're green and had a decent 2 and 3 drop. It's not really enough information to make a lot of decisions. But if you've played a reasonably lengthy game 1, you're going to start to notice things about their deck and their deck composition. And this is where game 2 starts to, I would say level 2 of sideboarding starts to come in. And a classic example that I'll use is actually Neonate's Rush. I think is a really good example in the current set, but there's going to be something like this in every set. If you were playing against an opponent, my face is covering that up, isn't it? Still is. I can't actually position this so that you can see it. Where did it go? There it is. You can see most of it here. This spell costs 1 less if you control a vampire. Neonate's Rush deals 1 damage to target creature, 1 damage to its controller. Draw a card. Good lunchtime, Lord Cynic. So this is both an example of something that you could bring in conditionally on your opponent's deck, or play around if your opponent's playing it. There's a lot of people that are main decking a Neonate's Rush. I have main decked 1 or 2 as well. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. However, if you've got a couple in your sideboard and maybe you weren't really playing a vampire deck, but you notice that your opponent's deck is just chock full of 3/1s, and in this format that would look mostly like green-white, especially at common, because you've got a lot of X1s that people play. Cathar Commando steps out. Ambitious Farmhand is an uncommon, but something that people will play pretty consistently. Like, there's a lot of X1s in white, and there's at least 1 at common in green. I've played these. I've seen people play that, although I probably wouldn't. You've got the 3/1, depending on where they put the counter. You've got this left over. You've got tokens from this thing that just pinging those off and then drawing a card is incredibly valuable. Yeah, there's a ton in blue as well, right? Like, we just had an issue with an opponent that had those, and I was looking to side them out and couldn't. And that's what I'll bring to the next part, right? Like, yes, you're down a card if you use it on a bait hook angler, but it says draw a card. So the thing about Neonate's Rush is, it's okay to main deck, but pay attention to when you should bring in more, because there's times you should be playing 3 of them if you have 3 of them. And also pay attention to how many your opponent has and what you could do about that, right? Because, like, let's say that I have a deck that's playing 2 of the Cathar Commandos and 1 of the green 3/1s. That's pretty reasonable. I've played a lot of decks that had that, but I know that my opponent has 2 main decked Neonate's Rush. And as I look through, I'm like, these are the only 3/1s that I have. They don't have enchantments that I'm worried about. Why don't I just take these out and play something else? I could play things that aren't X1s. I guess we'll have to peek at... Yeah, I've got the commons in here. It may be actually difficult to find stuff that you'd have in your sideboard besides those, but I don't even think it'd be crazy to, like, take out a couple 2-drops and bring in some Ritual Guardians if you're going on the play, as an example. Or maybe you have a couple of the Pestilent Wolves that didn't make the deck that are sitting in the sideboard, and you're like, I'd rather be aggressive and hit Coven. So this is level 2 of sideboarding. It's like taking out stuff that's bad against your opponent's deck. Bringing in stuff that might be good. And like level 1 is still little things like, they've got more flyers, I'll bring in a second Bird Admirer. Like, these are things you can do too. You could also be in a scenario where you have a couple flyers, your opponent's main decking 2 Bird Admirers, and you're like, fine, I'll take them out. Like, let's say I'm going up against a green deck that has 2 Bird Admirers and the 2/4 Spider, and I'm playing blue-white, and I didn't quite get there and only have a couple of flyers. You can cut them. It's okay. And just go for the ground pounder. Because, like, you can attack right through these 1/4s with, like, a 3/2 and not even care that much. Even bring in a combat trick and just chop them down. Is this making sense so far? I think that's most of what I wanted to get across, so I will now open the floor for questions if you have any. If not, I'll enjoy my soup. I'll wrap it up with this then. I would try to use about the full 1.5 to 2 minutes thinking about it. Remember that when you're playing, there's a button up here in the top right that says View Battlefield. You can click that, go back and look at the board and their graveyard. and kind of decide, like look at all of the cards that they've played, all the things that have died, go through and really get a feel for what their deck is. Scotty, thank you for the raid. And I think you're kind of losing some value if you're not going back and looking at the battlefield and really thinking about those sideboard cards. Aloha, Scott. Scott is good people. You should follow him and watch him draft. Doing well, my friend. And it is very good to see you. Y'all follow Scotty, watch him play. All right, that's about all I wanted to talk about with sideboarding. So thank you for hanging out with this lunch lesson. And a big thank you to some of the coolest people on the planet. That would be Paul, Jesse Punk, Rusty, Adrian Hero, Joe, Jesse, Jacob, Scott, and Fasty. Thank you for supporting my content. If you'd like to be a patron as well, there's a link below to my Patreon. You can see your name up here in lights as well as get some other cool rewards. Thank you very much for supporting my content. We'll see you soon.